For most of its history, America's banking system has been one of the most fragmented in the world, and that was no accident. It was a deliberate choice to keep financial power from landing in the hands of just a few bankers, but it wasn't always this way. Back in the late 1800s, if there was one man who had his hands on more of the financial world than anyone else, it was John Pierpont Morgan. In this video, we dive into the story of J.P. Morgan, the man who owned America. You can't talk about J.P. Morgan without mentioning the influential family behind him, especially his father, Junius Spencer Morgan. Junius was a powerhouse in American and European banking and made it his mission to mold Pierpont into his own image. Despite young Morgan's bouts of illness, his father was determined to prepare him for the family business. After school, Pierpont dove into Wall Street, eager to tap into the booming American market. With his father's connections, he secured an unpaid clerk position at a small New York bank. But this wasn't just any clerk job. One of his key tasks was to be his father's eyes and ears in America, keeping Junius informed about the latest in the economy and politics. In 1861, he decided it was time to branch out and started his own company, J. Pierpont Morgan & Company. This was the beginning of a whole new chapter in his life, one that would eventually make him a giant in American finance. But just as he was getting into his groove, the country was thrown into chaos. The Civil War, North versus South, tearing the nation apart. In March of 1863, Congress passed the Conscription Act, drafting all able-bodied men aged 20 to 45 to join the Union Army. Like other wealthy men of the time, such as John D. Rockefeller, Morgan shelled out $300 to dodge the draft, hiring a substitute to fight in his place. A few years down the road, Junius Morgan set up a sweet deal for his son, Pierpont. He connected him with Anthony Drexel, a Philadelphia banker with strong ties in London. With a hefty $5 million in seed money from Junius, Pierpont and Drexel teamed up to create Drexel, Morgan & Company in 1871. However, throughout his life, Pierpont was big on taking extended vacations, often disappearing for months at a time to recharge his batteries. He knew how to work hard, but he also knew when to step back and take it easy. This doesn't take away from how laser-focused and determined he was. In fact, Morgan's intense focus catapulted him to unheard-of success in the banking world. While the average American was scraping by on just $500 a year, Morgan was raking in over $500,000 annually, an astronomical amount back then. That made him a powerhouse, especially when dealing with the railroad industry. But the railroad industry wasn't exactly smooth sailing. It had overexpanded. Railroads were a massive business, with startup costs ranging from $17 to $35 million, a far cry from most other industries. Fortunately for Drexel, Morgan & Company, only a handful of banks had the financial muscle to back such costly projects, with multiple companies competing fiercely against each other, often laying down parallel tracks along the same routes. This cutthroat competition slashed profit margins, making it tough for anyone to dominate the field. While guys like Carnegie were controlling the steel industry and Rockefeller had a grip on 90% of America's oil, the railroads were a chaotic free-for-all. True to his nature, where others saw chaos, though, Morgan saw opportunity. Instead of just buying stock and sitting back, Morgan took a hands-on approach. He'd buy into a railroad company, then take a seat on its board of directors, reshuffling the leadership to run things his way. By getting directly involved in the management, he could steer the company to success, all while tightening his grip on the industry. As Morgan's reputation grew, so did the size of the deals he brokered. So when two railroad giants threatened to wreck the entire rail industry, and with it the American economy, who else would the country turn to but Morgan? The Pennsylvania and New York Central railroads were locked in a fierce battle, undercutting each other at every turn, with profits shrinking by the day. What these companies didn't realize was that their feud was shaking the foundation of the American economy. British investors who had poured a staggering $1.5 billion into the railroads were getting nervous and started pulling their money. This was especially dangerous since railroads made up more than two-thirds of America's publicly traded companies. If these two giants went under, the ripple effect could have been disastrous for the young American economy. Morgan knew something had to be done, and fast. He came up with a bold plan that required both railroad presidents to agree to a truce, but neither side was willing to back down. So in typical Morgan fashion, he invited them aboard his yacht, the Corsair, for a cruise down the Hudson River. There, they debated Morgan's proposal, but Morgan had a trick up his sleeve. He refused to dock the yacht until they both agreed to his terms. Essentially, he held them hostage on the boat until they gave in. Not long after, on April 8, 1890, Morgan's father, Junius, tragically died in a carriage accident. While his father's death was a heavy blow, it wasn't without its silver lining. Morgan was finally free to invest and spend as he saw fit, stepping out from under under his father's shadow and also inherited the lion's share of his father's fortune, totaling $15 million. Back then, the US dollar was backed by gold, so anyone could trade their paper money for gold at the bank. To keep this system stable, the government always held at least $100 million in gold reserves. But in February 1893, the reserves dipped dangerously low as European investors cashed in their US currency for gold, sparking panic. The rail industry collapsed, with 192 lines going bankrupt in a year, and a third of all American train tracks were shut down. Morgan instinctively knew that the only way to save the railroads was to merge them. When the railroads came to him for help, Morgan laid down the law. He'd only step in if he was given full control. Drexel, Morgan and Company became the top firm for major rail lines, raking in hefty commissions. But Morgan gained more than just money. He earned a new level of fame and influence. Even though he managed to stop the railroad disaster, the U.S. Treasury was still in deep trouble. Gold was the backbone of the American economy, and that backbone was crumbling fast. So, Morgan came up with a plan to restore America's gold reserves and sent it straight to President Grover Cleveland. Confident that his plan was the answer, he was shocked when Cleveland shot it down. Without hesitation, Morgan rushed from New York to Washington, determined to meet the president. The government was losing $2 million a day from its gold reserves, and the situation was worsening fast. The morning after his arrival, Morgan finally met with the president and his cabinet. Despite their reluctance to listen to a Wall Street banker, Morgan won them over. President Cleveland accepted Morgan's offer to form a syndicate of U.S. and European investors to replenish the government's gold reserves. Within minutes in New York and hours in London, the gold bonds were sold out, averting disaster. Morgan had successfully bailed out the U.S. government, saving the country from collapse and restoring faith in the economy. With all that influence, it's no wonder folks were getting a bit uneasy about one guy like J.P. Morgan holding so much power, and there's no better example of that than what went down in 1901 when Andrew Carnegie came knocking. Carnegie Steel was raking in a cool $40 million a year, but Carnegie himself was ready to hang up his business boots, so he jotted down a number on a scrap of paper, $480 million to be exact, and had it sent over to Morgan's office. Now, most people would need a minute to think about dropping that kind of cash, but not J.P. Morgan. He took one look at that price and said, "Deal." Just like that, the biggest business transaction in history at the time went down, making Carnegie the richest man on the planet. But Morgan wasn't done yet. He took Carnegie Steel and turned it into the United States Steel Corporation, kicking off a buying spree that put him in control of 60 to 70% of the country's steel production. And in doing so, he didn't just build a company. He created the world's first billion-dollar corporation, U.S. Steel, worth a mind-blowing $1.4 billion, which was about 7% of America's entire GDP at the time. But Morgan's grip wasn't just on steel. His latest venture, Northern Securities, scooped up two of the biggest railroad companies in the country, giving him control of a third of all U.S. rail lines. And considering that railroads made up 60% of the stock market's value back then, people started to wonder if J.P. Morgan didn't just own the steel and rail industries, maybe he owned America itself. In 1907, Morgan's skills were put to the test again when the stock market took a nosedive after the collapse of the United Copper Company. This wasn't just a minor blip. It dragged down the entire mining industry, took out two brokerage firms, and even a bank, all within the span of one chaotic weekend. Panic hit the stock market, and soon there was a full-blown bank run. President Roosevelt found himself in a tough spot. Despite his differences with J.P. Morgan, he knew that this was the only man who could pull the country out of this mess. The administration reached out to Morgan, giving him a cool $25 million in government funds to use as he saw fit. Morgan brought together the heads of the nation's biggest banks and trusts, but not in some boardroom. No, he had them gather in his private library. The mission: to figure out how to save the nation from financial disaster. Legend has it that Morgan laid out his plan for the bigger banks and trusts to pump money into their struggling competitors. Then, in classic Morgan fashion, he locked the door while the bankers hashed out the details. Thankfully, by the early hours of the morning, the nation's top bankers had reached an agreement. Morgan had successfully organized the capital needed to bail out the failing banks. By the end of the week, the crisis was over and J.P. Morgan was hailed as a hero. As he strolled down Wall Street, people cheered him on. But this was the last time any one man, especially a Wall Street banker, would wield that kind of power over the entire country. Even in his 70s and semi-retired, Morgan's influence was undeniable. In 1912, he was called before the Pujo Committee, a Senate group investigating the immense power of elite bankers. They uncovered that Morgan controlled a staggering $22 billion in capital across 112 corporations and 341 directorships, more than two-thirds of the country's GDP at the time. Though the senators couldn't find any illegal activity, the investigation led to major changes, including the creation of the Federal Reserve and the introduction of permanent income taxes. But these final years were tough for Morgan, as he faced harsh criticism and grappled with how history would remember him. While traveling in Rome on March 31st, 1913, Morgan passed away shortly after midnight, marking the end of an era. Wealth, power, and influence, J.P. Morgan had it all. Some despised him, others looked up to him, but one thing's for sure, there will never be another J.P. Morgan. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our future content. See you in the next one.